Welcome everyone. Myself, my name is Ron Thompson. I'm one of the co-organizers of FISL 2022 at Brock University. And this is the 13th annual conference, and we're very privileged to have it here at Brock. Tonight's lecture by Munro has been made possible by a grant from the Faculty of Social Science Dean's Discretionary Fund. So I'm going to have the Dean also welcome us in a moment, but I thank her for her discretion. Okay, that's great. And of course, we want to welcome those of you who are from outside of the FISL or the Pronunciation and Second Language Learning and Teaching Conference community, who are also here from the broader community. We're glad that you could attend. So I'll turn it over to Dean Ingrid Mack.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to Brock's campus for the 13th Annual Pronunciation and Second Language Learning and Teaching Conference. I invite you to begin by reflecting on where we find ourselves tonight. Brock University acknowledges that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous peoples. It's always a delight to support and take part in research events hosted by departments and centers in the Faculty of Social Sciences. But I think this conference tonight is especially noteworthy for a number of reasons. First of all, this evening, we have a talk presented by Dr. Munro of Simon Fraser University, and we welcome conference participants from actually all over the world. I've just met a couple of them. And also we welcome interested members of the public. I'm sure you're all looking forward to learning more about the topic today, which is Dr. Munro's research on accents. Second, as you may be aware, PSLT is the only North American conference of its kind. It regularly welcomes international presenters and participants and is well known as a friendly and supportive environment for sharing research. The opportunity to listen, engage, network in person is exhilarating and, especially in these times, perhaps very refreshing. As some of you may also know, this in-person conference is a long-awaited realization of a vision that dates back to 2020. The conference, originally scheduled for August of that year, had to be postponed because of COVID. The following year, organizers from Brock's Department of Applied Linguistics and University of Alberta and Simon Fraser and Iowa State University mobilized to put together a fully virtual conference to be hosted by Brock, marking the first time ever online proposed conference in PSLT history. So kicking off now in person, 2020 conference proves the old adage perhaps that good things come to those who wait. The next few days offer an array of opportunities to connect, to learn, to explore possibilities, those that center on learning and teaching pronunciation in very diverse contexts. From looking at the schedule, I can see that you will enjoy workshops, speakers, poster presentations, teaching tips, and I'm very delighted that you'll be able to do this on Brock's beautiful campus. I can tell you that you have come at the perfect time of year. I hope you'll be able to enjoy some of the gardens, the forest trails, your outdoor gathering spaces, all these things that our campus has to offer. And then, of course, these will be there once the rain stops. I wish each and every one of you you a really, truly wonderful experience. Thank you so much for inviting me to welcome you. Well, thanks very much to the Dean for that lovely introduction. And now it's my turn. My name is Tracy Derwing. I'm one of the organizers of the conference. It's my turn to introduce our guest speaker. And by the way, and to welcome all of you. Thank you so much for coming. It's great that you're here. But before I introduce anyone, I'd like to take you back to 1980. Now, if you were born then, you might remember some of these events. And if you weren't born, then you might have heard of some of them along the way. These events from the distant past. So in 1980, Prime Minister Joe Clark lost the federal election to Pierre Trudeau. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. Terry Fox, a Canadian hero, began his marathon of hope across Canada to support Canadian cancer research. Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington state. The first referendum for Quebec's secession from Canada was defeated. The 1980 Olympics in Moscow were boycotted by 65 countries. Pac-Man was released, and John Lennon was killed in New York City. It was also the year that Murray and I met while we were teaching ESL. You know, I met Murray in Edmonton, Alberta, and I feel so lucky to have been his friend and colleague for all of these years. First as ESL teachers, then as graduate students, and later as researchers. So Murray is one of the brightest people I've ever known, and also one of the funniest, which I'm sure you'll discover today. You know that already. Murray's academic trajectory has always had a language focus. His first degree was in education, where his major was modern languages. Taught ESL and citizenship to adults, and continued on his education in linguistics. He had the opportunity at one point to study with the world famous speech scholar in Birmingham, Alabama, Jim Flavey. So he loaded up his car and started a big adventure. Murray returned to Edmonton to finish his PhD, the focus of which was on second language phonetics. And he received a prestigious postdoctoral Short grant to work again with Jim Flavey. And then in 2004, he was hired as an assistant professor in the linguistics department at Simon Fraser University, which is in Burnaby, BC, just outside of Vancouver. At Simon Fraser, where Murray still works, he developed several new courses for students, including one on forensic linguistics, which is really popular. And he continues to publish prodigiously. He has over 70 articles and chapters to his name, as well as several books, as you can see here. But this book is the most pertinent to us this evening. It's called Applying Phonetics, Speech Science for Everyday Life. It has always been Murray's goal to examine aspects of language, and accent in particular, with an aim to contribute useful and practical knowledge to our understanding of the way people communicate. Early on, for instance, he examined many Canadian human rights cases to find instances of accent discrimination and how they were dealt with at the time. This article is still used in many teacher education classrooms because it clearly outlines different types of accent discrimination.
Murray has also worked extensively with matters of comprehensibility and intelligibility of second language learners. And together we've determined that these speech dimensions are related but partially independent. Together with Ron Thompson, we also examined the longitudinal trajectories of the speech of language learners over a period of 10 years. And we found that individual differences are far more important than anyone previously recognized. Among other honors and numerous grants, Murray holds the Simon Fraser Dean's Medal of Excellence Award. And last fall, he was inducted into the Royal Academy of Canada for his contributions to our current knowledge about language. One of the reasons for these awards was a recognition that Murray possesses a rare skill in that he's very good at examining aspects of language development at the micro level, the very fine detailed level, and yet he can also look at the macro level for the big picture to see how all those seemingly disparate puzzle pieces of language fit together. So with no further ado, I'll ask my good friend and colleague Murray Munro to take center stage to deliver PISL's first public lecture. And it's on foreign accents, their mystique, social meaning, and scientific significance. Thanks.
How about now? That'll work. Well, I need to angle this a little bit. There we go. Okay. Have to open up a different file. Hey, that's not where I want to be. Back to the beginning here. There we go. Okay, thank you so much, Tracy. That was really a very kind introduction. And thanks to PISL for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks to the faculty and also the Department of Applied Linguistics for the support of the conference and for this talk as well. This is the first, as Tracy said, the first public lecture. And it was pretty hard for me to decide how to pitch this. And so I'm not going to show you any data whatsoever, but I figure that, I know there are a lot of conference attendees here, I figure this will be a way to start out that's more light and entertaining rather than truly substantive. So I hope that you have a good time. The title of the talk is Foreign Accents, Their Mystique, Social Meaning, and Scientific Significance. And what I mean by that, I hope will become clear as we go on. Ron knows how to solve problems. So let's start off with this word foreign, which I deliberately use just to be provocative, because foreign is sort of, that's a weird word, right? What do we mean by foreign? Well, generally speaking, foreign means different, not from here. And that might be understood as a bad thing or a good thing. It can go both ways. So just to illustrate a few things here, if you have a foreign object inside you, that is not a good thing. Everybody agrees on that. This is somebody who swallowed a wedding ring, apparently, and also apparently a puppy dog. I found this on the internet. Foreign film, on the other hand, most of us think of that as something exotic and interesting, and certainly film buffs like foreign films. Those are a good thing. Foreign invasion, usually not a good thing. But if you mean the British invasion of North America, well, most people think that was, at least of my generation, I'm not so sure about younger people, but we thought that was a pretty damn good thing. Foreign exchange student, unquestionably good. We all like to be one. If we've ever been one, we like to interact with foreign exchange students. Okay, so why am I going on about this? Well, this talk is about the two different orientations on foreign accents. We can see them in both lights. We can see their effects in both lights, and I'm going to try to highlight some of the ways in which that's true. Okay, and I'm going to kind of downplay the word foreign from now on because it's kind of unclear exactly what that means, and I'll bring that up again in a minute. All right, let's now go to the next word, accent. What is an accent? Well, not this. It's not easy to define this in linguistic terms, actually. It's pretty hard to come up with a very satisfactory definition of what we mean by an accent. But roughly speaking, it's a pattern of pronunciation. It's pronunciation as opposed to vocabulary or syntax or something like that. That's tied to a region or a particular group of speakers. Now, this is for the non-linguists in the audience. Linguists have determined the percentage of the Canadian population that has an accent. And what is that population? What is that percentage? 50%? 100%. 100%, right? Did I fool somebody? Okay, good. Everybody has an accent. It simply can't be otherwise. An accent is a relative thing. And the accent that you have, whether it's in your native language or your second language or your third language, can be tied to where you grew up, the particular community you belong to, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic background, and sometimes a few other things. So there's no question that there are all kinds of factors that play into having an accent. But we all have an accent. My accent is Western Canadian English. In other languages I speak, I have some other kind of accent. In Canada, Canada, it seems like such a vanilla place, but we actually have a fair degree of diversity in dialects and pronunciations. And starting with here, Southern Ontario, Atlantic Canada, prairies. How many people here are not from Canada and you're from somewhere else? Okay. Well, you're going to get a big dose of Canadiana. Is a Canadian accent a foreign accent? Well, if you're not from here, you might say, yeah, sure. If you are from here, you might say, oh, no. It certainly is if it's used in Australia, or the US, or India, or Hong Kong. But let's remember, there are different kinds of Canadian accents. Now, the first one I'm going to illustrate for you is associated with a TV show called Letterkenny. And if you've ever seen this show, you either love it or you hate it. And the writer and actor Jared Kiso, he's the co-writer of this show, he describes it as lowbrow and filthy. And that pretty much sums it up. It's hard to even find a clip that you can show because every second word is a curse word. So how many people have actually heard of this show? Okay, all right. Well, Jared Kiso plays and is a guy from rural Ontario who grew up as a hockey player, speaks like a hockey player, has a very, very distinctive way of talking that most Canadians are quite familiar with. I'm going to just play a quick excerpt from the show.
There's been an incident I'd like to talk
Yeah. Is that loud enough or should we turn it up? Turn it up? Yeah. Turn up the do it again.
There's been an incident and I'd like to talk about it. Get at it. For better patter, let's get at her.
Spit it out, big shoes.
Okay, this show is all about language, and it's a linguist's dream, actually. There's so much linguistic stuff in it. So this little clip that you saw, apart from the pitter-patter, let's get at her, and that kind of stuff, had a shibboleth in it. Shibboleth is a manner of speaking, such as the pronunciation of a word that indicates your origins or social group membership. And so here's your quiz question. What shibboleth did you hear in the clip? About, right? I'm going to play it again.
There's been an incident and I'd like to talk about it. Get after it. Oh, pitter patter, let's get at her.
Spit it out, big shoes.
Okay, so not only did he say it, but she did as well. All right, so this illustrates the phenomenon known as Canadian raising, which is called that because the tongue is supposedly somewhat higher in the mouth than it is, for example, in US English. This is an extreme version. This is about as extreme as you can get, even more extreme than me, and I'm fairly extreme. I really do say about when I'm not thinking about what I'm doing, about what I'm doing. Can't help it. And it's a systematic phenomenon. It isn't just restricted to these words. It occurs in the diphthong out in a whole lot of different situations. Okay, but the interesting thing is that this is, even though this is a Canadian stereotype, it's certainly not uniform across Canada. And one place where we don't see this is in that part of the country, the Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland. And what I've got here is an interesting clip showing two Canadians from a well-known TV show, a radio show, sorry, but this has been videotaped. And that's Jared Kiso over on the left. And then we've got Tom Power, who's from Newfoundland, on the right. And there's a lot of back and forth. I'm just going to play you a little clip of Tom Power saying the word about, and have a listen to the way he says it, but also listen to the rest of what he says and the way he says it, because it's distinctive.
When you first sat down here, we were talking about friends of mine in Newfoundland who are never excited about anyone I speak to. You know, I could be talking to, you know, Tom Hanks, and they'll be like, yeah, whatever, give it up, what do you do better than me? They are so excited that I'm talking. You have a lot of people who really love this show. How you feeling? It's
Okay, so he certainly doesn't say about, he says something much closer to the American about, something like that. He also says, when he says A-R-E, he pronounces it R. Kind of like that character from The Simpsons. It's a little bit of a stereotype, sort of seafaring English kind of pattern, but that's actually heard widely across Atlantic Canada. And he has a very, very noticeable Newfoundland accent, I should say. And this is, you know, this is part of his personality, this is part of his identity, and so he contrasts really quite sharply with the person he's interviewing. Okay, let's move now to the prairies. And what I want you to think about for a second, and now it's just I want you to think about this. How do you say this word? Oh, I heard some Canadians. All right, I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to tell you about some research being done by a graduate student at the University of Alberta who's studying the pronunciation of that very word, among other things. And what he's interested in doing is comparing speakers who live in Edmonton with people who live in rural Saskatchewan. And so he's gone out and made recordings of people, and I'm just going to play what he's got from on this word.
fire, 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 fire. Fired, 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 fire, fired.
Hey, now the guy from rural Saskatchewan, did you notice how many syllables does he have in that word? Two, right? Very clearly 2 syllables. And there's a very distinct difference. Actually, this is an extension. This is also a type of illustration of Canadian raising, vowel a little bit higher than the mouth. And there you go. So how do I say this word? Well, I have to confess that if I'm talking off the cuff, I sound more like the rural Saskatchewan guy than I do like the Edmonton guy. And I've actually surveyed my sisters. Now, I was born in Vancouver, grew up in Alberta and BC. So I'm a Western Canadian through and through. But, you know, I moved around a little bit. One sister of mine was born in Alberta, raised in Alberta, but in kind of a rural setting. She very clearly says fire, fire. And so do I. I very often say something much closer to fire when I'm not thinking about what I'm saying. I've got recordings of myself doing this. Have you ever noticed me doing that? Yeah. I don't know exactly why I've never spent any time in Saskatchewan to speak of, but for some reason I want that. All right, now the PSLLT conference is mostly about second language accents, but really second language and regional accents, there's a whole lot that they share. There's a whole lot to talk about that these types of accents have in common. A second language accent is usually understood to be aspects of the sound system of the first language being transferred into the second, as we know. I'm going to show you a little trick. If you know this, don't give it away, please. I don't know how many people here are speakers of French. Okay? And how many of you have learned French as a second or additional language? Okay. Now, maybe you've seen this before. It looks like if you read it, who has seen it? If you look at it and you're a speaker of French and you've never seen it before, you may just scratch your head and say, what is this gibberish? It just makes no sense at all. It looks like a poem written in French words, but there's a little trick to it. Now, the way to illustrate this trick is to go into the Apple synthesis area under accessibility. And what I did was to select a Quebec voice, Nicolas, who is a Quebec French speaker. And I used Nicolas to read this poem out loud. So what I want you to keep in mind is that this is a Quebec French voice producing only French sounds. Okay? It's entirely based on French.
Humpty Dumpty, c'est un noir. Humpty Dumpty a 2 minutes de travail. Un ballon qui ne sans cesse, un ballon qui ne se mène, Humpty Dumpty douillet de regret.
All right, so it's a pretty good rendition of Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. And yet, there are no true English sounds in there. This is all based on synthesis. And it's material taken from French voices, using AI, of course. So, as I said, the voice is actually speaking English, but using French sounds. It's speaking English in the sense that this was designed, purposely designed. So what's interesting here is that it's possible. It sounds like we have this audio. It's possible to speak a language in a particular language, speak one language using the sounds of a different language, and still be understood, right? You could still recognize what the words were. Okay, so it's true that aspects of the first language sound system are transferred to the second, but of course, most second language speakers don't sound like that synthesis. They don't transfer everything, and as a result, they don't sound as extreme. So a good example would be Cruz. She would probably pronounce her name Cruz. What I want you to do is just listen for some of the words that she pronounces here, because saw live question in school.
I'm wondering, on the day where your children, how do they react to the news that both of their parents are astronaut?
Well, they found out later because when we saw them, live, it was 2:30 p.m. Here, and they were in the school. And then when we told them later, the only question that my daughter asked me was if there was going to be any cake to celebrate. That was the only comment, and I think that's a very healthy reaction.
Okay, so she's a very charismatic speaker. What you notice about her accent is that it certainly comes through in a lot of the vowels very strongly, and because and so on. And when she says live, she devoices, she produces the B as somewhat of an F-like sound. And also, another thing that she does that kind of gives her away as a non-native speaker is the way she said she produces a hesitation form. She says a rather than or something like that. And it's interesting that a foreign accent can come through in that way. All right, as almost everybody here probably knows, if we define accent as how different, or accentedness, I should say, as how different the speech sounds from your own speech or that of the community, then we can judge an accent or perceive it to be very slight, very strong, to somewhere in between. And our way, Tracy's and mine, and many other people who do this type of research, typically obtain data using an accent judgment task, which involves having listeners put on headphones and listen to the speech sample and then rate the degree of accent on a scale. Whereas intelligibility, on the other hand, is a contrasting notion, deals with how much of the speech is correctly understood. And that can range from low to high. We can assess that using this type of task where we have someone listen and type what they hear, so that we count the number of words that they get right, and that's an assessment of intelligibility. One of the points that I've made over and over again, and Tracy's made over and over again, is that research using these tasks shows that the strength of an accent is not very closely related to intelligibility. So you can have a strong accent and be 100% intelligible. So what do you think about Penelope Cruz? Does she have a strong accent, a moderate accent? What's your sense of that? You think about a 7? 7? Okay. How many people would say lower than 7? Okay. Anybody think it would be higher than 7? All right. What about her intelligibility? Almost perfect, right? I don't have any trouble understanding anything she says. I got everything out of that. And, of course, she's an actress. She has to be intelligible in her work. But it's interesting how there can be this quite clear separation between the strength of her accent and her intelligibility. So there's no correct answer to the question of how strong her accent is, but I would have guessed that most people might say 4, 5, or 6, depending on where you're situated in terms of your experience with accents. Okay, let's move on to Steve. And here, I think a good example is Dracula. I've got a clip here. Lugosi was born in what was Hungary, but then later became Romania. He has a Hungarian accent. And in this clip, I'd like you to just listen for his trilled R in children, but also to the rest of what he says as well.
Children of the man, what music they make.
Okay, now can you imagine Dracula without a Hungarian accent? I mean, it's the Hungarian accent that's the whole story here, and it just is it's very much part of the identity associated with Dracula. Let's move on to another. Now he has a strong, I would say he has a strong accent. I don't know about you, but let's do an intelligibility test. I'm going to play you another clip from just a little bit later on and see what you can get. I want you to see if you can fill in the blanks.
I trust you that you're coming here to see. I followed your instructions implicitly. Excellent, Mr. Enfield. Excellent. And now, if you're not fatigued, I would like to discuss the leads and Carfax Avenue. Yes.
Okay. How'd you do? So, and now if you're not too fatigued, he produces the 2 very, very fast and very short, and so it doesn't come across as a long vowel. I would like to discuss. Have you seen this? Okay, the lease on Carfax Avenue. Yeah, some people got it here. All right, I'll play it for you again.
Now, unanimously, I would like to discuss the lease and CAPEX spending. Yes. Everything is in order, awaiting your signature. Here's the lease.
Okay, so there's some support that you get from the context that comes later. Here's the lease. So if you did miss lease before, well, you get that. But one of the reasons why Carfax Abbey might be hard to get out of there is that that may be a name you've never heard of, probably is, and so it's hard for you to, because of his accent, connect that with what that's said. So. Very scary. Do you think his accent is authentic sounding? Yeah. Yeah, well, that was part of the style. And then this very slow delivery and also the intonation. Okay, glad to hear that. Here's a more Canadian, it's a Canadian politician that people from outside the country may not know about. He was at one point the leader of the opposition in Canada. He's a Quebec politician, and you know, because he was in Quebec and he was mostly interested in having Quebec separated from the rest of the country. Knowing and speaking English wasn't really, in fact, didn't really have high priority for him, probably, although his mother was a native English speaker. She was of British origin. Now, I'm going to play you a little snippet from election time. Oh, you can see that.
The modern economies can be the block apart from the environment.
Yeah. There's something real tough about that one. Again.
The modern economies can be the block apart from the environment.
Okay, I love this one because no matter who I play it to, they never know what he's saying. But I figured it out. Now, okay, we'll do a little bit of analysis, those of you with linguistic background.
The modern economies can be the block apart from the environment.
It's word stress. It's completely word stress. That's the problem. It has nothing to do with sounds. Can you change your accent? And should you? Well, you have to be careful about this, because depending on who you are and how you find yourself, the effects may not be what you expect. So there's one social rule that seems to be absolutely true in North America anyway, and that is if you change your regional accent, beware. Especially if people think you're trying to sound too posh or too, you know, more elegant than you are. People back home may mock you. So, you know, if you can imagine, if you're a Canadian and you imagine some friend of yours going to the UK and coming back with a British accent, you know, that's not going to go over very well. That seems pretentious and awful. Now, this woman we're going to see here, she is mean. She is mean. And she takes apart Madonna for the fake accent that Madonna developed after she moved to the UK and married Guy Ritchie.
Madonna's technically American, but her home is wherever she's the center of attention. She was born in Bay City, Michigan, 2 hours outside of Detroit, nowhere near England. Her fake English accent really took off in the early 2000s, but its origins are disputed. In producer Nile Rodgers' memoir, he claims that while they were making Like a Virgin, Madonna picked up some of his girlfriend's English mannerisms. Madonna apparently had a nose for advancement, and instead of staying at her own apartment, she, her then boyfriend Sean Penn, would stay at Niall's girlfriend's Victorian home. She picked up the accent sometime between then and when she saw Rodgers decades later at Sting's birthday party. Others are noticing the accent in 1985, around the time Madonna was filming Evita.
I perceive it as an excellent chance to grow as an actress and a singer.
She still had the accent in 2000 when she was co-starring in The Next Best Thing.
Maybe I'd like to have a button before it's too late.
When I was spokesman at the time, said that she just absorbed the accent of the people she's around. So because she was spending so much time with effort, naturally she picks up an English accent.
Robert is the most compatible man.
Okay, all right, so you can see that this person doesn't really think very highly of Madonna or her accent. I'm just going to show you one more little snippet.
I think that it's not just Americans that are obsessed and consumed with being famous and looking beautiful. I think everyone is these days.
It's almost impressive that she sticks with the accent so faithfully when it's so obviously terrible.
I feel like Americans don't appreciate my.
I don't think it's terrible. I don't think it's one thing or another. It just is. But it's just interesting how much uptight we get about these kinds of things. And yeah, sometimes people can change their accents, and it's just really a non-issue. Now, changing to a different accent in your native language is indeed sometimes possible, as we just saw. Not everybody can move between one accent and another. One person who does, by the way, is Gillian Anderson. She's just really remarkable. She grew up in both the UK and the US, and people still sometimes, give her a hard time about her accent too, or her accents. But the best way to refer to her is by dialect. Now, there is a very curious double standard here. On the one hand, we knock native speakers for changing their accents, and at the same time, we sometimes shame second language speakers into trying to change theirs. We tell them that they should change their accents. So you can't win. We're all familiar with this kind of thing. Accent reduction, lose your accent in 28 days, reduce your accent in 10 minutes, and so on. This is not a good thing. The accent reduction industry, and it really is quite an industry, works through fear mongering, playing on immigrants' insecurities. Your accent will keep you from getting a job, exaggerating claims that you can do things for you in 28 days, quackery, presentation of accent reduction as a medical procedure, and then just generally a lack of scientific basis. And part of the reason why this is developed is because of accent discrimination. And as Tracy mentioned, I've done some looking into accent discrimination in Canada, and there's no question it exists, and it comes in different forms. We don't know to what degree it exists because it's very hard to measure. And it's not like we get reported cases or something like that. We find out about these things sometimes through human rights tribunals and newspaper reports, but there's sort of no way of systematically evaluating them. So mocking or bullying coworkers or employees because of the way they speak, denying someone a job because potential coworkers or the public might not find their accent appealing. In other words, we don't want you at the front of the store because people don't like the sound, okay? And denying someone a job or a residence or a service because their accent suggests that they're from a particular country or ethnic background. Now, strictly speaking, that's not so much accent discrimination as it is discrimination on the basis of their place of origin, their history. But accent is the clue. Accent is the key to this. And on the basis of the accent, this kind of decision is made. Now, the thing about accent reduction is that it really can't help with this, even though accent reducers seem to think it can. The fact is that most adult second language speakers retain a non-native accent, but the majority of them are highly intelligible. So for those who have intelligibility problems, well, we don't need accent reduction, we need intelligibility improvement. And of course, there's no scientific evidence that you can take a typical adult learner and make them sound like a native speaker. Also, and we know this at this conference, there are no secret methods of teaching pronunciation. It's all in public. We do this conference in public. We talk about accents and teaching pronunciation. and all that kind of stuff. I think if there were any secret methods, we would have heard of them. We would know about them. So that's just silly. And then the other thing to point out here is that after accent reduction courses are completed, speakers will still have accents, even if they're somewhat reduced. And so if they experienced discrimination previously, they're likely to continue to experience it, unfortunately. That's the problem. So the solution to accent discrimination is not accent reduction. That's just not going to happen. And by the way, some of the harshest criticisms of second language accents come from second language speakers themselves, including some of us English Canadians who learned French. Okay, and if you learn French as a second language, and many of you have, I'm going to play you a clip of our former Prime Minister, Lester Pearson. Now, Canadian Prime Ministers are expected to be bilingual, but what kind of bilingual is another matter. And there was a time in the 1960s when we had one Prime Minister after another who just could not speak French to save their lives. And I'm going to play you Lester Pearson in 1967, opening Expo 67 in Montreal in French. That was a bad idea. Okay, so if you studied French or learned French, or if you're a native speaker of French, just let me know your impressions of what it sounds like. Actually, okay, oops, sorry. Now, I'll show you what my reaction to that is. And I just can't help it because, you know, as someone who studied French, you know, I'd say, surely you can try. You know, you sound like the synthesizer, except in reverse situation. Yeah, we tend to be harder for second language learners ourselves on other people who maybe don't do as well as we do. He must have been at the bottom of the class. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, and also, it's worth reminding us, as many of us know, it's not just English speakers who can have negative attitudes about foreign accents. And there's excellent work being done in Poland, which is a hotbed of research on accent, as we know. This was a study of Poles' attitudes towards foreign accent Polish. There's also research on Japanese speakers' reactions to English accented Japanese, and so on. And guess what? It doesn't matter where you go. People tend to not like foreign accents. They tend to react wrongly. Now, here's an interesting flip side, though. And this was something I didn't know about until recently. And that is that second language accents are now being used quite a lot in marketing. Because in some situations, it's a really good thing if you can market your product by having a spokesperson who speaks with a non-native English accent. Wow. So it's an asset to speak with an accent. And this website, the Delphi Studio, have you heard of this? They, I don't know if they're a good place or not, or how ethical they are, but they have voice actors who are not native speakers of English, who naturally produce English with a whole variety of accents. So they have a fantastic website that you can go to. And you can select the accent you want. So it might be a little hard to see, but you can choose, for example, Chinese accent in English. There are many different Chineses, so I don't know what might be there, but Spanish, French, Farsi. That's another one. And I'm going to play you an excerpt from Nadi, who is a Farsi speaker. Now, associated with these files are information notes about each of the speakers. So you can find out what they look like, where they're from, you can find out their information. And in case it's of interest to you. And then you can even download, anybody can download clips. Of course, if you want to use something on your website, you have to pay them to do the performance for you. But you can get for your website or other commercial purposes a recording of this person saying something about your product. So let's listen to her.
Hi, my name is Nali. I'm an artist. I'm from Iran and live in Los Angeles. I speak English, French, and Persian.
So that you might want to try that out. Hearing different accents from different speakers. I was just going to mention, I hoped to be able to get a clip of this, but I couldn't. Apple, when it released some products last week, had a keynote where they had a speaker come on who had a non-native accent. I'm sorry, I can't remember which accent it was. I think it was a Middle Eastern accent. But in any case, he seemed to have been deliberately chosen because the speaker was talking about very technical things, giving a lot of technical details. And I thought, why would Apple pick him? Oh, I know. Because he sounds like he ought to know about computers and stuff like that because of his accent. Maybe they did it wrong. All right, now here's another interesting thing that we maybe should pay more attention to at Consult. In sociophonetics, we often think about second language accents that morph into regional or ethnic accents. So we're familiar with this in terms of world Englishes. These are communities of speakers who grow up speaking a variety of English whose speech reflects their heritage. And in India, in Singapore, and more recently in Hong Kong, new English accents have emerged. And something in Canada as well that you may know less about. And this is res accents. Have you heard the term res accents? Okay, in Canada that refers to reserve, Indigenous reserve in the US reservation. And speakers with Indigenous English accents grow up speaking English. They may or may not actually speak an Indigenous language proficiently, and they may not live on reserve. And this woman summarizes that rather succinctly and illustrates a res accent. She's from the US, so I guess it should be a reserve accent.
Ever noticed natives got an accent? That's a res accent. Oh, look. You don't even have to be from the res. The city natives have a res accent.
Okay, so the key thing here is it's not something that comes from imposing your native language sounds on the language. This is something you learn. This is the way you talk. This is your variety of English. Just like other world Englishes in Singapore and so on. Now, fortunately, there's a growing recognition of aspects of Indigenous English accents in Canada. There's actually research going on. Some scholars in BC wanted to draw speech language pathologists' attention to the fact that a res accent is not disordered speech. They were concerned that speech language pathologists might mistake aspects of an Indigenous accent for disordered productions, some learning delays, and so on, when in fact they have nothing to do with that at all. They're just the way the kids talk. That should be left the way it is. Canada is starting to see more and more prominent Indigenous actors, and I'm going to show you some more Canadiana here. This is an interview with, done by George Strombolopoulos a few years ago with Adam Beach, who's one of the best known Indigenous actors in Canada, this super handsome guy. And he grew up on the Dog Creek Reserve in Manitoba. And when you listen to him, you're not going to hear much of an Indigenous accent because he's an actor. He can move in and out. If he wants to do one, he can do it. But there are a few vestiges in the way he speaks off the cuff, but you'll have to listen carefully.
That everybody is the first Adam Beach on film. I called everybody. I said, you have to watch this. I called my cousin and he said, I missed it. And I said, how? He said, I went to the bathroom. It's like a little spot that's lost in the dirt, right? Yeah. Oh gosh, I remember paddling a canoe and I pressed pause and I watched that thing for 4 years.
Okay, so when he said the bathroom, that was probably part of his accent. There's not a whole lot else there. But what's interesting is that Adam Beach and others are now working on ways of teaching, doing accent training for Indigenous actors, including teaching them how to use Indigenous accents in film and television and so on. And here's some research actually funded by Social Science and Humanities Research Council. It's done at York University across the lake and in Toronto. And actually, they're doing some serious research to try to identify different, subtle differences between different Indigenous Englishes, and also to develop training techniques. And Adam Beach talks here about the importance of Indigenous actors playing Indigenous roles, because for some time, and you may know of TV shows that feature somebody, a character who's supposedly Indigenous, but the actor isn't. So the question is, well, why don't we actually have more Indigenous actors playing these roles?
Fill in those shoes that I can fill in, and I think we as Native people haven't yet embarked on teaching people who we are, showing them our dire straits and our successes, whether we are, prostitutes, gang members, lawyers, doctors. We have a message to instill in the world.
Well, I've tried to, in this talk, cover the things I said I would, a bit of mystique, a bit of social meaning, and a little bit of scientific significance. I wanted to close with an interesting question. Is it okay to imitate an accent on your own? Well, before you say a blanket no, you're not going to say a blanket no, because of course it is perfectly okay under certain circumstances. You have to be careful though that you don't go so far as to be insulting, patronizing, or caricaturing in ways that are just racist. So the Count certainly gets away with it. I'm going to let the Prime Minister of Canada have the last word on this. Talking about his ancestors.
Was also a passionate fisherman. And unfortunately, back then there were rules around who could fish in which streams. And about the 4th or 5th time, the local constable caught him and threatened to throw him in jail if he caught him once again fishing in the Lawrence stream. His family lore has it. My grandfather said, great-grandfather said, but if I cannot fish, I cannot live. So he went home, unrolled his schoolhouse maps, looked at the big map of Canada, pointed to a spot on the west coast of the country that's there. British Columbia, where we can be free and no man owns the fish. So he packed up his belongings, his family, including his 2-year-old son, Jimmy, and they moved to BC.
Okay, so he's pretty good. He has a pretty good Scottish accent. I've got it great. And he did this in Scotland, by the way, and people laughed about it. So it all depends on the circumstances. Of course, the fact that he has Scottish ancestry doesn't. Thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure to be able to give this talk. I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank the Department of Applied Linguistics, Brock University, the Dean, for opening, the many other funders, and I'm sorry I didn't take the trouble, I should have probably to list them all here, but you're going to see that on the program. So I figure I can get away with that. And thank you very much.